Welcome everybody to this very, very special salon that came out of two things. One, a couple of years ago, I read Agnes's essay in Harper's Magazine called The Eros Monster and felt that this is one of Agnes's best. I mean, she's always good, but this one I was like, holy shit, like someone had to write this piece. And one of those, like the ending of a good movie where everything makes so much sense, but you never saw it coming. That's how I felt about this piece. It's almost like a thriller in itself where we solve just the biggest problem in life. It's fine. I mean, just Agnes, I would imagine on a Sunday morning, waking up in her pajamas and doing this thing. And I think, Agnes, you and I, we did multiple events together. You did a Fernando Pessoa one that was wonderful during the pandemic. When everybody had pandemic hair and everybody cut off the video here so that you don't see it. And then we did the Esther Perel event together in January with Merve Emre and Sky Cleary, which was fantastic, talking about realistic love. And I think one of the essays in the reading list there was this piece, The Eros Monster by yourself, but also Breaking Points, which is another favorite of mine by you. About the ethics of breakups, right? Very closely related. And then we also did one on forgiveness and revenge with Elizabeth Brunig and Jennifer Banks from Yale University Press up at Yale this past April. So we kind of like went into multiple different angles of this. But one thing that we never really discussed, even though I think, and I'm sure this is why we have a lot of young women in the room, this is something that is actually quite a common experience, is when a hierarchical relationship gets eroticized or becomes kind of like a familial, like family-like thing, or both, which is even more confusing, or when something where it starts as a familial relationship or as and under that I also kind of gather the topic of siblings, or group the topic of siblings and chosen siblings, or it becomes hierarchical. And then by hierarchical, of course, like teacher student as well, not just boss employee. And then much later, I think 3 or 4 years later, Irina, who also did an incredible interintellect salon on medieval self-help and the medieval origins of contemporary self-help, which kind of ended up being a very thorough discussion of sex and how surprised medieval people were by their orgasms. And it was amazing, right? We had a lot of fun. And then I came across your piece, The Professor. I think I read it in long form, right? But you published it somewhere else first, if I'm not, no, there first.
Long reads. It was
long reads, not long form.
Yeah.
Sorry, my heat wave brain. Long reads. Sorry, long reads editors who are my friends. I really apologize. And which starts as a kind of short story, almost very kind of Romanian new wave, very simple, only a few characters, complicated parental relationships, even more complicated relationship with the professor who becomes a kind of parental, or is he, figure. And I felt that you guys kind of wrote a story from two angles. It's like a Faulkner book where different characters explain something very similar in different styles and from different angles. And of course, there are so many sides to this story. First of all, maybe the professor's right about this. Philip Roth, there are the dying animal. You can read so much about the male angle here. And so I thought this would be very interesting to discuss. The angle that we three agreed to kind of start from is the familial angle. My thesis here, as somebody who has been, a student since since forever and have had similar situations in my life, I think it's the familial ties that complicate this the most. And we have people here from around the world with their own different experiences. Wink, wink. One person here even married her professor or his professor. Maybe he or she will want to share this story. And it can go in so many different directions. So I thought, let's just talk a little bit first about the two pieces. First, we will talk about Irina's piece, The Professor, and then we will talk about the Eros Monster, and just kind of open the discussion and ensure that everybody gets their time on the stage and gets to ask their questions to Irina or Agnes, or just make a comment. You're very welcome, guys, to just like raise your hands when you feel like it, or if you judge the room that it's a fine moment to just jump in, you're also welcome to do this. I mean, you are all experienced salon goers here and even hosts, so I trust your judgment that you will, pick the timing right. Does this sound okay? All right, these are the house rules. It's a complicated topic, so you need some house rules, right? And you need to kind of like set the context because it's so personal. So Irina, Agnes, welcome. Irina, let's talk about the professor. Tell us what happened.
Oh my God. Well, I've been obsessed with teacher-student relationships for a very long time. And when I was an undergrad at University of Toronto, I was about to say U of T, but that's not so specific. The University of Toronto, one of the grad students said to me that he had this theory that every dissertation is autobiographical, but sometimes it takes people a while to figure out how it is or they have to, some people can't finish their dissertations because there's something they haven't figured out about themselves yet. And I that is my theory that I subscribe to, because I think that is very much true. I was working on a dissertation on difficult emotions and teacher-student relationships in medieval literature for about 3 or 4 years before I put it together with the fact that my father was my mother's professor. That took a while,
It's always the most obvious thing that
you would think so.
You never think about it.
One of my friends was working on a medieval letter, and it took her about 3 or 4 years to figure out that it might have something to do with the fact that her father was a postal delivery man. Sometimes the most obvious things are the hardest to see. So I think that was sort of the origin of it, was this interest in how my understanding of their relationship had changed over time, and how much the story of their encounter in the classroom was part of that relationship and was part of the context I grew up in. And then I also had in undergrad, I worked with, or let's say I came into the circle of a professor who is probably the best known in my field of Old English studies, definitely the most influential, the most powerful. And now I can say this without being sued, a notorious sexual harasser. Although, I can say that because my face has been plastered on the front of a section of the Toronto Star, going on the record about it.
It's not really private anymore.
It's not private anymore, and so far I have not been sued.
Isabella, did you know about this? Being a Toronto error? I don't know, what's the demonym? No? Okay. So it's new to some people in Toronto. Maybe
Toronto also protected him for many years, and until Oxford hired him, and pretended not to know. So I had a lot of anger. I had that situation. He didn't, have as much of an effect on me as he did on other people who I was very close to over the years. But his behavior, and really the refusal of our field to deal with it in any kind of way, led to a major split in our field, which is I mean, there are like 12 of us on the planet, right? Not 12, but, not a lot more than 200 or 300 on the globe. So it led to a major split in our field, and it made professional life really difficult and unpleasant since, I would say, 2017, 2018. And like many bad things. So, I think there was that aspect of the sort of the professional, but I think I was also, part of what I was interested in was the extent to which I had thought I could manage someone like that. The extent to which I thought I could handle light harassment, by swatting the hand away from my leg, and not understanding all the different psychological things that happen when someone empowers that needy, that go beyond the really obvious sexual kind of impositions. I sort of had to reckon with the fact that I had invited him to give a talk, and I'd sort of placed him in the presence of my own students, knowing, how he behaved with students, because he'd behaved that way with me, but figuring it was all sort of manageable. So I think I was also interested not just in sort of these kind of the more obvious power dynamics, but how we play along, or how I played along and the things that I couldn't see 20 years ago or even 15 years ago that in hindsight became much clearer. So that's what that essay was about, in a sense, also trying to understand my own role in that. As someone who thought she was in control of a situation that she wasn't always in control of.
Which is part of the game, right? So, I mean, a lot of, in general, when a violent act is committed, whatever the severity, one of the reasons why victims are always at a disadvantage by default is because it's the first time it happens to you, while he has been doing this for decades, right? So he knows how far he can go, how to read the room. Like, it's very rare that, thankfully, that the victim is also as experienced at being a victim. And by the time women become very experienced, you become experienced and you start avoiding it, right? So you don't become experienced and stay a victim. At least most people don't. And especially with students who kind of have this high turnaround, whereas the professor stays, and professor can be here a boss, a religious leader, whatever like authority position there might be. For that person, it's like a kind of roundabout, not even a roundabout, like a conveyor belt of like new students coming every year. I mean, where I went to school, it was, I mean, 9 out of 10 of the professors were male and 9 out of 10 of the students were women. And
I mean, I think, could I just, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but I think what I came to see, I mean, partly through the experience, but also writing about it, and that's why I think writing sometimes is so helpful, is just how impoverished our vocabulary for this kind of thing is. Because, in the sort of Me Too reckoning, quote unquote, which I think has sort of fizzled out into not very much, there was a particular kind of story that became visible or more visible. It had been around for a long time. But I became, I think some of the people who I knew who were hurt the most by this particular professor were not women, were male students who were really derailed in their careers by what he did to their ego. And I don't think he didn't in any way that we would usually talk about or understand sexually harass them, although he sometimes did make fun of them or poke fun of them in a sexualized way. But I think we just didn't have a vocabulary to talk about all the things that happen around what's really obvious, kind of grotesque. What's his name? The film producer coming in a bathrobe in the hotel room. I think it's so easy to miss the other things and then for people to blame themselves because there's just not a vocabulary for all the other sort of pressures and manipulations and teasings and things that aren't the same as they would be if they were between two equals, right? So I think that's just what I learned.
In general, toxic, no boundaries, instrumental usage of people. No, I mean, there's no word. That's why we say.
I think I'm just not happy with the vocabulary we
Yeah.
have. I want a better vocabusary. Yeah.
But I have to say, like,
There's
Musa
always
Al-Gharbi
also a
was
kind of projection of desire from the student, like it can be seen. This person might see me and might give me some kind of value. And that's also very powerful to be in that position of being able to see someone, right?
and the forever not knowing whether you're smart or good, because the whole like foundation, like in a dictatorship, with the morality here, with your intellectual value and your achievement, completely messed up from day one, and you will never know whether you are dismissed or you're promoted for your actual value. But Musa Al-Gharbi was on my podcast last week, and he is very, very critical of woke. And like one thing I severely disagreed about with him was Me Too, because I think Me Too was a complete paradigm shift. And the reason why we can talk about these things this way is because we can't really go back. I will open that at the end. I just want to go through all the other topics, but I think something is different. And this piece that you wrote, the professor, if this was 1994, when like, the art schools and the Bennington colleges, even in the US, not just in France, it's like a harem. Like I went to school in a harem. I was not part of it because I was such a nerd and I grew up in show business. So I thought that the professors will be nice. For me, everything was already skewed. But I came out of the library after 5 years and I was like, where is everybody? Like everybody was doing something. And I was thankfully not part of it. Isabella, you have your hand up. I'm sensing a strong Romanian and Eastern European presence, by the way, in the room. It's just the side.
So there's a couple of things. There's so many things already, Irina, that you've mentioned. one of them is that I'm Romanian and I'm of a certain generation where my mother taught me very explicitly how to use sexuality and for power. And you know, I'm an academic. I was a professor for a very, very long time, et cetera. I married my own master's professor, had 2 kids, still there, whatever it is. 50% of the professors in our department were married to their students. It was all men to women. It wasn't the other way around. They were all younger women. But there's a couple of things that I want to problematize. One of the problems with the narrative of victimhood of the students, even though I 100% agree, obviously, with, you know, predators who do this as a regular thing, et cetera, is that in any context where you're really excited about intellectual ideas, both people can actually be really excited about and attracted to those academic ideas. And one is status, but the other is who the hell else was around developmental psychology in that context, right? So there is this kind of regular, and the victim narrative definitely is the right one to have in certain contexts, but also it takes power away from a great deal of women like myself and others who ended up married who had no victimhood in turn. We knew exactly what we were doing, and it was problematic, and there was ways that we dealt with it, like legit in terms of the hierarchy. But there is a problem because people calling me and others the victims in contexts where we were adults and there was a power relationship, but there was also some intelligence in the way that the power was dealt with. And so even though I completely think that we should err on the side of protecting the students, protecting the power relationships, and absolutely not allowing that, it isn't as simple because we don't talk about this other side that is actually complex and interesting, and also the ways that at least some of us were taught to use in a problematic and not so problematic way our power in different ways and our intellect through different channels.
That's actually why I don't think I use the word victim, because I'm not particularly happy with that vocabulary either. I mean, I think I would probably err in just a slightly different direction. Although, I mean, I've also known teachers, you know, mentor-mentee marriages that lasted for a very long time, you know, or till death. And, you know, it's hard to tell what a relationship is like, you know, when you're not on the inside. Maybe
I
it's
mean,
hard
your
to tell.
parents, right? Your
Oh,
parents.
no, they divorced and it was terrible. And I think the dynamic that was set up at the beginning was poisonous till the very end. Yeah. But I couldn't, you know, as long as I thought the relationship was normal, I thought the teacher-student thing was great. And when you know, when it unraveled, I saw how bad it had actually structured their relationship all along. But that's one, you know, that's one pair, right? I wouldn't, but, you know, I think there are also differences between people who have a shared passion, and the kind of person I saw, you know, I called him a serial sexual harasser, but I don't even, I mean, I'm not even happy with that that vocabulary. I was thinking about this when I was rereading Agnes's essay today, and I was just thinking how little eros there was in the room. There was almost no eros. That wasn't part of it, you know. I think sometimes it is in certain relationships. I mean, I trust and believe, and I've had crushes on, you know, older, more authoritative men too, because of a shared love of something as well. But actually it was very interesting. That was a very unerotic context. It was very, even the one really obvious pass he ever made at me was so mechanical. It was so it was so unflirtatious even, you know, like I feel like I could flirt with the best of them, but it wasn't, it was it really was about something other. It was about ego or power, depending on the moment, you know, or male competition or intellectual competition, sometimes with the women as well, a kind of envy of the younger women who were smart. There were lots of emotions in that room, but actually this passion, this, I mean, whether powerful and overwhelming or even low-key simmer, that wasn't there. That was never there. in these contexts, which I find really interesting. I was sort of noticing that when I was rereading that essay, like it was a very unerotic space that this person created around him. And really not about even the love of the material as much as it was about, here is my position in the field.
Hmm.
These are all the presses, I control. These are the journals I edit. This is what I can do with the phone call for so and so. This is the book contract I gave so and so. This is the book contract I gave that person. I'm responsible for that person getting that job. It was that kind of thing. It was not, so I think a thing that can look the same from the outside to people who are not in it might be very different from the inside.
But also between the two pieces, there is this distinction that Isabella, you are so beautifully made, which is to me, for me, the Eros monster, and I really want to give the mic to Agnes to help reflect on this together. But like to me, that's more erotic, because however weird that relationship you are describing in the Eros monster is, at least it's really personal. Whereas to me, the professor is more about, and this is where to me the victim question comes into play, where it's not like two people flirting or being like super into the same idea, which is already very eroticized for people to whom ideas are important, right? Because you're talking about the shared love of something that is the driving force in your lives. Whereas on the other side, you have this almost like mechanical, such a good word, where one person is the machine doing the same thing every year, decade after decade, and these random women get into the mill and basically got ground up the same way. And it was so weird because like when I published this event and I was like, this is going to be about the professor and the Eros monster, multiple people DM'd me on Instagram and Twitter, like academic women, and sent me names, whether these essays, and they sent me like altogether 10 names. So both things happen a lot. There are people who just have these one-off gigantic crushes with people that last for years and might end up in a marriage, might end up in a breakup, whatever happens. But there are also these guys, probably tenured professors with a very recognizable MO. And it's recognizable, but not unique. And so people might end up sending you 5 names. And first of all, I have no idea who these essays are about. And also I know for a fact that they are not each about 5 different people. So, but it's kind of telling that there are these grapevines, but probably too late. And there are too many people to actually like end up talking about the same person randomly. I know about one event that happened where multiple people figured it out, multiple women figured it out, and on WhatsApp they called the guy together. But that is a Family Guy type scenario. Anyway, Agnes, welcome to the club. First of all,
can I ask
yeah,
you a
go.
question?
The whole floor is yours.
Because I'm so interested in the most recent description that you gave, which is like, here's a person who had a certain kind of status and he could lord it over people. But then I feel like I want to inhabit like the younger you who found that person to be magnetic and compelling in some way, and try to get a grip on like what was that? Why did somebody lording their status over you strike you as so compelling, as someone, there's a line that I loved in your piece where you're like, you decided you weren't going to get a letter from him, but then his knowledge was an even more valuable gift. So that there was this idea of him giving you these gifts that you almost couldn't turn down. Anyway, I just wanted to hear more about that.
I mean, I think that answer would be different depending on the age, right? I think when I was 22, 23, I think I felt I could stay pure of the power plays, and I describe a moment in that essay when, at a bar with a lot of us. That was actually the same evening he put his hand on my leg, where a young woman who's now a successful lawyer somewhere said to me, I should probably cut that. She said to me, I don't really want to be here, but I've heard that a letter from him can get you into any graduate school,
Right.
and
Yeah.
and so this is why I'm here. And
Right.
I felt I could be pure. I never asked him for a letter for graduate school. I got into my graduate school of choice without a letter from him, I actually did not even finish my paper for him. That's, I think I felt I could maybe that was it, that I felt I could exercise a certain kind of power over the situation by setting the terms of engagement, right? What I didn't understand, what I didn't understand at the time, and what I would have said 10 years later, was that I had found the closest possible person I could find to my father in my university, in the terms of what my university offered. And I reenacted a kind of drama that I had been reenacting with my father. And it was very weird. He also had a weird kind of thing. He really didn't like my father and would get kind of angry about him. And I would get annoyed at that, because what did he know about my father? It was a very strange sort of situation, Maybe it was a sort of acceptance that at that point I was already losing from my father, because I'd chosen not to go into medicine. But here was another professorial figure with a very kind of similar narcissistic profile, who could say, no, you are clever, you're going in the right direction,
Yeah.
I think that's probably what I was looking for then. And I do think I wanted to be seen. I do think I wanted to be seen. And I don't think he
For
was
me,
really capable of that.
you saying this thing you said twice, like, I can handle it. To me, that's
Yeah.
the biggest cue that there was some kind of victimization, because it's part
Yeah.
of to make the person losing out to feel
Yeah.
responsible, keeping the other person at bay.
Yeah. And I think I was very keen. I mean, he offered me a book contract at one point when I was on the tenure track, and I said no, So I felt I could sort of be in this relationship and still have a certain kind of power over myself by refusing all of the gifts, right? By keeping it at this kind of pure intellect, like I'm really only interested because you might occasionally have clever things to say about Old English literature. In hindsight, he didn't even have that many clever things to say about Old English literature. That's the tragedy of the situation. There are many, many cleverer people who didn't try to play mind games. But I think, yeah, I think it was sort of the wanting to be recognized in a certain kind of way that was so powerful at that age. And I've seen it with friends who have been in, I don't want to give away too many details because it's not my, my story, but I've seen a situation with a friend who was in a sort of who was in a relationship, a consensual relationship with a faculty member when this person was a very, very young age, and really felt seen. But then the moment the faculty member withdrew the love, it also withdrew the self-belief, or, my friend lost the self-belief in their own ability to stay in the field and actually left academe. Maybe it was for the best. The person is doing much better now, but it was a very shattering event for that person, because that person could say you are worthwhile, not just as a beloved, as a lover, but as an intellectual.
It's like the Hegelian paying for like allowing the oppressor to oppress you in exchange for attention, right? Like that's the kind of Hegelian concept of why dictatorship. It's I think about this a lot since I read Richard Sennett. I want to go to Agnes, to you, if you allow, because we kind of are circling also the question of whether Eros is an intellectual monster, and whether Eros is even erotic. Which would be good to clear up. So can you tell us, I mean, without obviously, like, we share whatever we want to share here, like, how did the piece The Eros Monster come about? And were there consequences to it? I mean, you mentioned multiple people there in this piece. What happened after? Like, what would be part 2 about?
The person it's about tried his best to make it not be published. And by discrediting me and everything in the book, really did not want this piece.
How did he know that it was coming? Did you send it to him?
They fact checked it.
Oh, really? So somebody from Harper's called him like, hey, did Agnes do a pie chart for you?
He's like, everything in it was a lie. And then they're like, I'm like, I have like email receipts, like I can just send you for each thing. And but yeah, so that was really it was really stressful. And there was like a point where I thought, okay, maybe this isn't even gonna see the light of day. I think it was reading the Lena Anderson books that made me want to write it. I was like, somehow someone else had my experience. And then I'm like, it became a type of experience for me, but also one that hadn't really been articulated yet. And I felt that it was articulated in these novels, but that weirdly, it's like the novels just keep stating the experience over and over again, almost like a repetition that she sports into. And I'm like, here's the thing, you go crazy. Like that's what happens. Like I went crazy, that I couldn't think. My mind wasn't working. And I think it, some of it really resonates with what Irina was talking about, which is that I felt like I'd like outsourced my own sense of validation to someone else. And so that put me in such a kind of desperate position that like anything where you could make such a good argument to say, this is not working. I mean, it was the easiest argument in the world to make. But it's like, if you think here's a very weird comparison. Very weird comparison is Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living. But he doesn't say like examination works. He doesn't say you're going to make progress, you're guaranteed success, the examined life is amazing, right? You might think he didn't need to say any of that, because if you know the unexamined life is not worth living, then you got to do the examined life, no matter how bad it is, even if it's torture, even if you hate every second of it, you're stuck with it because the other one's not worth living. And it felt like that to me. That was my experience of like, I can't get out because this is somehow, it somehow had become my source of personal worth or personal validation. And it somehow got this feeling like if I could just, as I described in the piece, if I could just decipher it or decode it or rethink it somehow, that I would then understand and I would be able to break it off or make it work. And I mean, it's very weird because it's weird that you can both be on the inside of that experience of being crazy and know that you're in it, like know that you're being kind of crazy, that you're making stupid choices, but you don't stop. And I mean, I think I'm very interested in this question of power because, this person was, yes, they were more established than me. So in that sense, they had power over me. But I think that it was less that I thought that they would use anything against me or whatever. I wasn't afraid of that. It was more like the fact that they were more established helped in my seeking validation from them. But that really the power came from the erotic relation itself. It came from the fact that, he could make it very clear that he didn't need this. He was fine. It didn't much matter to him, right? And so he always kind of had the upper hand. And that's the other thing that Anderson describes so beautifully, right? This feeling of you never have the upper hand. And then you become obsessed somehow with getting the upper hand, as though that were love or something, right? So even your motivations, your goals become toxic goals. One thing I wanted to say kind of in revisiting this material and the Zadie Smith piece as well, which I loved, it's something that when I think about it now, one of the questions I would like to discuss about it is when you do tell a story like this, how do you tell the story without turning yourself into a victim? Like, that's something I wrestled with as I was writing it. I could feel you wrestling with it, Irina, in your piece. And like, an interesting thing is that you expressed a lot of anger at this person verbally just to us, right? But your essay does not express a lot of anger at this professor, at least not like very directly, right? So you were holding back from doing that. I often feel when I write things for a public audience, the editor is actually a little bit pushing me into the victim narrative. And it's like in some way, obviously we're always going to be the good guy in our own story, but that's somehow quite disturbing to me. Like in earlier stages of this relationship, like I wanted to write something together with this guy. I'm like, let's both write it. So that we can each have our point of view out there. I felt very dissatisfied with representing this on my own. Like, people are not going to get the full picture if they just hear my side of the story. not interested. Just wants to pretend none of this ever happened. And
I
but
do
I,
this in therapy. I always say to my therapist, like, that's just my side of the story. Like,
Right.
I feel so bad, you know, like, I
Right.
know I'm paying for this, but like, it's important, of course, to tell your own side of the story, but like, there's just one half. It's,
and it's somehow yeah, so it's somehow both you're only telling your own side of the story, and then the other part is just the um like the, you know, Irina, you were talking about the feeling of limited vocabulary, and I feel that almost like at a slightly larger structural level, like a limited set of narratives that are possible.
Yeah.
uh and I was trying in this piece to be like, this is a slightly new narrative. It's not like the thing you said, Anna, about you know, being a thrill or something. It's like that was partly the intention of saying, like, this is something new story. You haven't heard this story before. Don't try to make it the story you've already heard. But part of it is that me kind of not even quite knowing even now what that story is. Like, it feels a bit obscure to me. It feels almost like, for me to really know what it is, I'd have to try to cooperate with this person who does not want to cooperate with me in understanding it. In fact, that was the whole problem from the beginning, is that he never wanted to cooperate.
but there's also something in your story where, I mean, clearly I mean, this is not like, you're the pursuer in the story, right? But the other person is the enabler.
Right.
Like, imagine if this story, like, thought experiment. If both of your stories were about a high school teacher and not a professor, like, just change the age. So say Irina is 16 and this guy is going to help you finish high school. Your story, Irina, would change only a little bit, right? Maybe you would be still a very badass 16-year-old who thinks I can handle him. I have power, whatever. You know, we're
Just
Eastern.
remind, I had a high school teacher once kissed me on the lips.
Oh my God. Okay, there you go. I was just going to add, you know, Eastern Europeans.
It's not even a
But
big
like-
deal.
But like with Agnes's story, like, if this was like a 14-year or 16-year-old and a high school professor, we would think about this story as grooming. We would think about somebody who basically, through acting passive and pretending that he doesn't care and he's not doing anything, is basically egging on the women for whom this works, because there's a
I wouldn't necessarily think of it that way.
No, but why didn't he break up with Agnes then?
So the way I think of it is that it was a toxic combination of personalities. That is, I don't think he had so much more agency in this story than I did.
Because of the wife or the job situation?
It's just in his nature to be a bit passive. So, and some people are going to be a little bit drawn to that. And like, that is, some powerful men are quite passive. It's not a very common combination, but it exists. So I think he definitely enjoyed the attention. Like, he didn't break it off for all the reasons you would expect, right? He enjoyed the attention. And he enjoyed the thought of, like, maybe. So I think he's somebody who likes to live in that hypothetical zone of, you know, maybe his wife will leave him. Like, he would say that, like, you know, it could happen. And like, these things could, and I think he was, actually, he was being totally sincere. Like, that's like, that it's possible, right? And so, yeah, I guess I think, I don't think it's more weakness than being diabolical, I guess, is how I would interpret it.
I mean, I think the key here is that the fact that someone is more senior or more powerful in a field does not necessarily make them more mature as an adult or give them self-knowledge. I mean, these are quite different things. You can go very far in a professional, you know, have a lot of professional success while still being extraordinarily needy in terms of recognition and attention. And I think someone who can offer that kind of admiration, I think that admiration, you know, I never felt it, you know, myself to be manipulating anyone with admiration, but looking back, I can see that was something that, I mean, I get it also now, you know, like, I'm sitting here with emails and like students who don't talk in class and plagiarize papers. And so when a student comes along and, and is really keen on what you have to offer them, in terms of mentorship or teaching, that can be, very appealing. You want to spend time with that human being, because they make you feel like your entire life hasn't been a waste, right? So I think that admiration can be quite, I want to say a drug, I guess, a little bit, it can be quite powerful. Let's put it that way.
But women are also powerful, right? I mean, until a couple of years ago, we were allowed to talk about the power of female sexuality and urge women also to use this power more cleverly, right? We are urging men to use their own hierarchical powers better, but there is a different kind of power imbalance between an older man and a younger woman whom everybody wants because she's 24. Right. And
I grew up in North America. Women were not, the power of female sexuality was not, I haven't really seen it being something talked about that much in the past 20 or 25 years. Like
it's interesting
maybe
that
in Eastern Europe, yes. In Eastern Europe, a very different approach. Yeah.
I think women talk about it amongst themselves, right? You talk your way out of a parking ticket or get a free drink. Like we all know it, right? And when you're 24, 25 is however much you will have in your life, probably that's where you are the most powerful. So I would love to have a couple of old professors here to defend that angle. But I want to stop a little bit and just because I'm seeing a lot of thoughtful faces and there are a lot of messages, to just leave some space for you guys to jump in and share any stories, questions before we move on and talk a little bit more about the changes in society. We have multiple psychologists here, writers. So clearly you're drawing a very specific, an economist. We're drawing a very specific kind of audience today. Isabella, do you wanna say what you said in the chat?
I mean,
It's not like you can only talk once. This is not one of
I feel like I've already overtaken both the chat and what I've said, but I find myself I love stories. I love particularly stories of longing and love and loss and passion and eros and all of that. And I find myself wondering how much of our stories here and otherwise, I mean, Irina, I think your story is a pretty straightforward one of power gone fucking idiotic and lots of men in academia. We know that story, and I think it's a very valid and important one to tell. But I think our own personal stories of our experience of that, being strong women, intelligent, with our tenure and whatever it is, what I'm much more interested in is, yes, that tension of, is this a story about victimhood? Or is it actually a story of why the fuck was I lost my mind with this thing? And what are the
coming of age, right? A rite of passage. Like, oh, I had this happen once and I will never want it to happen again, right?
So I'm going to say something because I don't care what anyone thinks here of me. I do some of my best work when I get crushes, and I don't act on the vast majority of those crushes, but crushes have that eros. I want to impress, I want to engage, I want to put all my magic powers into working with somebody, and I find that deeply hot. And I don't want anyone to act on it. I don't want these professors fucking with me. And it's broken as soon as they try something on me. And there's plenty of conferences where you have these great conversations and suddenly they hit on you and it's like, ah, damn, another one that just broke the whole spell, right? But that's what I'm interested in talking about as well, is how do we navigate those and still keep in that tension and not think of it as something terrible or awful, or must we think of it as something terrible or awful?
Could I respond to that briefly? So I think we've sort of had we're having our East European moment. I was born in Romania and I grew up in Canada and was trained in the States. And I
guess and I are Hungarians, so we have the whole, we will map the whole thing.
So, and this is a
very, also Romanian.
My
there you go.
impression growing up between these two cultures was that Romanian culture had a much fuller sense of the way of the roles flirtation could play in life. And I remember particularly being 20 and seeing my next door neighbor, who at that point was 36, which seemed very, very old, flirting with my 80-something-year-old godfather and really teasing him, like laying into him and saying, "What are you, are you meeting with girlfriends? What are you doing?" And he was just getting red and completely, embarrassed and loving it, And I remember that was something that was very actually powerful for me at age 20, when that was more sort of this moment where I was becoming more comfortable with being a woman at all. Because I think the Canadian offer of womanhood that I'd been given was not very exciting for me. But I could see like, okay, you could just flirt with people for all sorts of different reasons. But the thing is, flirtation did not mean you had to go and have sex with this person or you even wanted to. My neighbor did not want to have sex with my godfather, right? She just knew she could make him feel like a man for a while, make him feel young and potent by teasing him a bit, right? And she told me later, she's like, "Did you see what I did?" And it wasn't to get anything from him either. It was just to make him feel good, And I think, the notion of flirtation that I understood growing up in Canada was flirtation is a prelude to a relationship or sex or something. It has to be somehow fulfilled. You can't just flirt for the sake of it. So I actually have been in multiple situations in the workplace where a much older man flirts with me. And I have been completely fine with it. And 20 years later, I'm still completely fine with it. And people were horrified. I remember people around me going like, "Oh my God, I can't believe, like he said something about your butt looking good." I'm like, "Yeah, that's fine. I know. He loves his wife. It's fine. We just have a thing, and I've seen like other people like North America, pure North Americans, I don't know, be very uncomfortable with that, but I was genuinely okay. But I think it was often, I don't know, there was a sort of vibe to it that I felt like we understood. And so we knew it was not going to lead to anything. And in both of the cases I have in mind, they never did the slightest thing that would push past it, right? They always kind of kept this unspoken contract of flirtation, and kind of friendship too, and just general, So I think that's the thing, like flirtation means different things in different cultures as well.
But in movies also, it's so when we're lamenting the lack of movie storytelling, it's because a lot of these gray zones that are so exciting and they are not necessarily exploited, it becomes exploitative when it's acted on. Like flirtation itself, if it doesn't want to push away or bully a person or really aggressively trying to make them uncomfortable, it can be a gift, right? I mean, fleur, it comes from a flower that you give to somebody. And it just kind of, we have an event in New York on the 6th of October. I think, Patricia, you will be coming, you will be here. And Esther Perel emailed me that she wants to come. And she complimented me because I, in one of the titles for one of the panels, I referenced a Buñuel movie. And we were talking a little bit about the Buñuel movies and how much I love Belle de Jour, how much I love that obscure object of desire, which could never be made today. I mean, the whole over of Buñuel is just the nuance, and that people are doing really weird shit in sex or sexuality or around. Even just the tension makes you do weird things. And that's, unless you're acting upon it in a physically or emotionally or professionally violent way, that's fine. And it's just, a good couples therapist understands that that's part of the thing, and the power dynamics can be shifting around a lot. Gina, can I, because just I know that we have a couple of people in the room. Catherine, you are an expert of trauma healing. Gina, you're a psychotherapist. Like how does this conversation feel to you, and from your own professional practice and angle, how are you approaching this topic yourselves, and how did it feel to read the pieces?
Yeah, I had something to say, but I didn't want to throw in the psychological angle too soon. That I was thinking of. Have you heard of Eric Byrne, Games People Play? Has anyone heard of that book? So I love that reference because I think of power also from like sometimes the child in us has the power, right? So his whole thing is like every person has an adult, a parent, and a child. And I think of like a student professor dynamic, if you're both playing the same game, you know, and maybe that does involve something it doesn't, then it doesn't feel wrong. And there's plenty of stories like that versus like you think you're playing one game with someone, they're playing a different game. So there's that. So it's just a communication issue. Then there's also you at the time, either you are an empowered child, so to speak, and you have the kind of the charm, and there's a kind of an equality there, even though it doesn't appear so from the outside eye. Or I think sometimes the victim part comes in if like you really were thought you were playing a game and you didn't communicate it well, or the other person saw what game you're playing and they're playing a different one. And so I think it really varies. I think it's important to kind of step out of the victim mindset to some extent, but only an adult version of that person can later tell you. Then I'll add one other complicating factor, which is like our memories are not reliable. Kind of the way we tell a story and how it happened, we know it changes the more we remember it. So I was thinking of this. I don't know if a lot of people know this, but the way memory works is we remember the last time we remembered something. We don't remember the actual event. So the more you recall something, less reliable the memory is, which is kind of disturbing. And so I think of like trauma, you know, of people who really were abused in that scenario. They hide it, they bottle it. It's a black box, and it's that you can't even speak to it. And then when it's voiced for the very first time many years later, that's super accurate. It's very vivid. It's felt experience. Somebody who's retelling the story and was like, you can't, you know, you're never going to believe what happened to my professor, you know, and they're retelling it. It starts to change depending on who they are becoming. And maybe they look back and they're like, I was totally in power the whole time. And I used, you know, I saw everything and I played the part that I was supposed to play. So those are all just a couple thoughts I had listening.
Thank you so much. Any notes on memory?
Yeah, I would just respond to that. I think also like the emotional valence of an event changes over time. So that also affects the memory, right? You might be so overwhelmed in a moment that you can't, I mean, you're processing it through some kind of lens. And I don't know, at least in my own experience, like the sort of platitude about time healing all wounds, part of that is also just like the emotional valence of that memory changes over time. And so you will actually not only think of it differently, but like might even be confused by that experience, may not even understand it anymore because it was only understood through the emotional context of the time. So I think that's also maybe one way in which memory is like not decayed, but like warped over time. That makes it also very hard to rely on them.
I mean, for myself, one of the questions that I always arrive at when I remember things, and as we age, we remember more and more things, right? Because our brain cells are dying, and they reveal the hidden memories. Is, you know, like our lives are driven by things we want, right? Like you make plans and you strive and you make progress and you are proud of yourself and like goalpost after goalpost. But if I think back into my past about the vast amount of bullshit I would want in specific situations, and it's like, why did I want that? And then you can start investigating, then, was I made to want it? Was I deceived? I love, Gina, this point, and I think it's one of the crucial elements of understanding our own lives, and a lot of tension and pain and heartache and disappointment comes from it. When you think you're playing a game with somebody and they are not. I mean, Agnes, you talked about it around anger, right? Like anger is basically this violent emotion when you thought that you and another person had agreed on how the world should be, and suddenly you realize that this person has a different concept, right? So we have, in order to cooperate and coexist with each other and be able to extend love to another person instead of fearing to be hurt or hiding away or, you know, pretending that we hate another person, we have to feel aligned. And if the alignment is not there, so I think this is probably, again, to go back to situations where there is kind of a consensual affair that might end up well or not, depending independently completely from hierarchical considerations. And then there's another thing where one person thinks, I know what game I'm playing, I can handle him. I can play this game. I can get better at it. And the better you are getting at your own game, the more kind of like enmeshed you are in the other person's game that you're not seeing, which is a little bit there in both stories, but in a very different, right? Like you're basically like digging yourself into the other person's trap willingly, like with some weird insect. To me, that's fascinating. But how do you clarify? I had yesterday a long conversation with an economist friend of mine. She researches gift-based game theory. That was because I was interested in the game theory of favors yesterday for some fucking reason, and you know, we kind of investigated that there is even a science to the kind of uncertain or assumed reciprocity. Like how many relationships rest on the fact that, you know, it's like Schrodinger's cat. You know, I keep making efforts, you know, doing favors to this other person, and I under the assumption that one day if I ask something, they will also do it. But unless you ask, it's the cat is both alive and dead, right? But when you ask, you have to deal with the information. It's either yes or no. So you basically ask when the value of information surpasses what the 50% of losing at this game would cost you. And in many cases, when you talk about flirting, like flirting with an 80-year-old man is so easy because you never have to verify reciprocity, right? It's just like a fluff. But if you're flirting with, you know, your colleague and you both just got divorced and you're sitting over a drink, you know, that's a very different thing because it's a verifiable reciprocity and he or she might make a move. What do you guys think about the kind of more complicated game theory angle here? I saw a lot of like faces of recognition.
Could I just poke at one small thing? I mean, I think, you know, I mean, obviously I wrote an angry essay about someone I called a serial sexual harasser, but I actually don't think of him as having like playing some kind, like masterminding some complicated game. You know, I think he was actually someone with, and is someone with a very, very fragile sense of self who was reacting in quite childish ways. I don't think there, I mean, maybe you could call that a game as well, right? But I don't feel comfortable with this sort of like, you know, we're sort of each kind of playing this power, you know, power interaction. Maybe that's not what you meant, Gina.
Yeah, so the games people play, the book, it has a bunch of little like diagrams. It gets like very kind of programmer like, so I don't love that part of it. But the idea is like the thing I think is important to take away is when you're in a child state, you and somebody else, that's love. That's a game of love. It's two people that are playing. There's no power, there's no authority. And so if you just remember that, right, all other variations outside of child are some kind of game where someone's like, hey, I told you to clean up the room and you didn't. You know, there's a parent element and the other person like, oh, I'm so sorry. And sometimes people love being parented in a way because it makes them feel protected. It makes them feel loved. And so the idea here is that I think a simple answer to whether a person is an abuse scenario is whether or not the other person has and is capable of empathy. So like if you play a game with someone, you're in a relationship, you should dedicate some time to wondering what it feels like to be or Irina in this scenario, and she's a student, and what is she hoping to gain? And it's more than just how to help you or to kind of give you what you want, but like feeling that you're at the beginning of this stage in your life and you have all these things ahead of you. And so I think it's like somebody not being capable of seeing that is a problem, which maybe is your empathy. And you're like, I don't think they were trying to not see, they just don't, they are not capable. Or to me, if they did see that and then they still took advantage, that's a whole other thing, right? That's like true manipulation where like they know how to make you feel what you needed to feel and they're planning to drop you anyways, or they didn't really care about you. So I think that's kind of the crucial part for me is like looking for empathy. And even like if you look at court records or like these really interesting like murder, mysteries are like always so popular. You're really listening if the other person knew what was going on. And it's always slips up somewhere where they say something and they reveal just enough, a little bit of knowledge that they're like, oh, that other person was aware. And it takes like a really keen ear to listen for that, because, you know, someone playing a game is just not revealing what they know. So that's kind of how I think of game. It's not necessarily like nefarious. It could be, but it also could just be like playful. And like, there's a good version of a game, like I said, which is like two people in like a very playful, no boundary kind of state.
But this also, first of all, I also think, if I remember this book correctly, that a game is kind of an instinctive reaction to a situation. And there's this assumption in the book that if you end, like, say, I'm going to see Agnes in her office at the University of Chicago, and I have to arrive at 4. I'm there at 4. I open, and Agnes has lost her pair of glasses and is in a frenzy trying to find them in the room. Then I enter a game, and I will, unless I'm a psychopath or have had a bigger problem before I come, but any reasonable person entering this room will start playing the other side of Agnes's game, which is I'm the helpful friend trying to help you. And I ask you, like, when was the last time you saw it, or tell you that you're wearing it, right? And so it's not like she's playing a game because she's a manipulator and I'm a victim because I enter. It's like how people respond to each other, right? We're very reciprocal. And like, if you find yourself in a bad relationship and like every day this keeps happening in my relationship with Agnes, then it's good to sit down and look at like, what game are we playing?
Yeah. And you can even have like a game. I love that part you mentioned of unnatural or instinctive. Like you can be recalling a game you used to play if you had a positive interaction with a parent and you're feeling that joy again. And even if it's someone who's not, and you're like, oh, this is on some level reminding you of this dynamic that you had. And so you get to like put on this mask and play this role. And then it ends. That's the point, is it doesn't just continue and you never leave the game.
But I kind of want to go back to Agnes a little bit, because if I assume that I'm in a game with somebody, or that he might be playing a different game from me, now I am in the intellectual erosis trap. Like I leave one trap, which is the mindlessly fluttering around in somebody else's game, maybe or maybe not. And now on the other end of it is this intense mental agony of constantly thinking about what actually is going on, or that I missed something, or that there's a cipher, a code underneath it all. And the only way to make the magic go away or the nightmare go away is by intellectually cracking it. So what is the balance point here?
So I actually wanted to go back to something Isabella was talking about earlier about, I love the Games People Play book, but I think something that a lot of sort of economic analysis misses something like the question, where does the motivation come from in the first place? Or where does the energy come from in the first place? It's like preferences are given, and then you walk into the room and then the game happens. But there's different levels of like energy and motivation that you can have in relation to an activity. And I think sort of like the idea, like I'm creative when I have a crush. It's sort of like I get this extra flow of energy, right? I'm not just doing things the way that I would anyway. And I think that's what is so both tantalizing and also dangerous about these kind of erotic encounters. First of all, it precisely is the ambiguity, right? So the flirtation, part of what creates part of the appeal of the flirtation, part of why it's energizing, is that it is ambiguous. So, it loses that when you disambiguate it, but you also don't want it to be disambiguated in the direction of like, nothing's going to happen. You want the ambiguity to stay there somehow. And that's, of course, precisely what was tripping me up, is like, I was in this perpetual ambiguity. And I should say that, like, sometimes I think of people as like, one way to classify people is like, some people are more boredom averse and some people are more stress averse. So nobody likes boredom and nobody likes stress. I mean, nobody likes either of those things, but the question is, which do you hate more? And I'm very, very far at the extreme of being boredom averse. I will just take a lot of stress to avoid being bored. Boredom for me feels like death. Like I feel like I can't stand it. I can't take it. And people around me are like, it's fine. Just sit, just be patient, whatever. And it's like, no, I can't take this. Whereas like you can put a lot of stress on me. You can put a lot of work, a lot of deadlines, whatever. I'll be fine. but not with the boredom. So I think boredom averse people we're inclined to put ourselves in these situations that are very ambiguous, but have a lot of possibility of like energy and charge, right? You're attracted to it, pulled into it. And I think that so that's I think and I think it's a really interesting thing with sort of intellectual projects is that we often need quite a bit of motivational help in like getting us through the project. So at the early stages of our career, it's about belief in yourself, thinking I can do this, thinking I'm worth it, I belong here, whatever. But actually, there's just a more general thing, which is like thinking that I'm going to get the answer because you don't have it yet. And you just are very liable to just kind of give up, or it's not going anywhere or whatever. There's always something else you can do besides your intellectual project that's more like kind of immediately rewarding. And so one thing that the erotic relation gives you is this kind of energy or charge that can pull you through those projects. That's sort of on the one hand. On the other hand, this is to pull in the entire a line of thought that goes entirely in the other direction. You know, something I've been thinking about, reflecting, hearing sort of Irina talk and reading her piece and thinking about these men who I also know cases, is academia breeds so much unhappiness in the most surprising places. So the people who you would think who reach the top, right? The highest status people, they're often like quite miserable. And I think it's partly that like they were always the high achievers, and then they got somewhere and there's nowhere up to go, but it isn't what they expected it would be. Like just a pretty good fraction. I'm not going to say half, but like more than a quarter of people who get tenure basically hate it. And like they're miserable and they should just leave, but like they can't because there's just this incredibly powerful sunk cost thing. It's just a huge problem in academia, in my view, is that it seems like you'd be crazy to give up tenure once you get it, but like actually quite a lot of people should do it. They wouldn't be crazy, they'd be happier, they could live better lives, but it's really hard. Anyway, I think that these, there's just some number of these abusers are just men who succeeded and they're just really unhappy. And they are like, they didn't get from this success the feeling of self-worth that they thought was coming. So they're like searching for it from generation after generation of women. And so there I want to say, so I was, in a way, this is why I say pulled in the direction. It's like I was praising this idea of Eros as a source of energy. And I agree with Isabella that that's like a positive function. But then for that very reason, it sort of gets harnessed by people who are in kind of a desperate position, a kind of desperate unhappiness. Trying to pull themselves out of that desperate unhappiness. And then, so anyway, those were the thoughts that were popping through my head.
Can I just pop in with two things I've been thinking a lot about? One more recently is just, I think with any work of the intellect or art or, any sort of, especially any large work that takes a lot of time, there's just no way anyone can appreciate it enough for the amount of effort you put into it. I mean, it's maybe most perverse with academic monographs because I spent 12 years, if you count my dissertation and the rewriting, on publishing this stupid monograph, which, it's at 11 reviews, so 11 people on the planet have read it, and I think some grad students have read some chapters from it. You know what I mean? Like 12 years of my life for like less than a baker's dozen of human beings who have read this book, right? But even, I think even if it had been 20 people who had reviewed it, or, you know what I mean? Like, how many people could tell me that it was fantastic and write about it, and that would somehow be proportional in any sort of way to that effort? And I think that's true for any really large and extended project. Maybe there are a few people on this planet who get the kind of attention and praise and appreciation for their novel or whatever it is, that feels sort of proportional. But in most cases, it's just going to be way off, right? So that lack, that kind of, that feeling of I put so much of my heart into this thing and it just doesn't matter to the world, that's sort of built in a lot of creative or intellectual work, I mean, my father was an engineer. He built a bridge in Romania. People, I guess, use that bridge. So he could just point to the bridge and say, look, it's still standing and people are going over it, right? But we don't have that, with our weird little monographs, right?
But
But
I think, sorry.
yeah. I mean, the other thing I just wanted to throw in is I guess what sometimes my frustration with the sort of the focus, either whether you want to call it sexual harassment or the eros of teaching, is that I feel like we also don't spend enough time talking about other ways that good teachers can give that energy. I found this language of energy really useful, Agnes, because I realized for me, the sort of the dominant men led to major blocks. I could not write for those kinds of men. Like really, really I couldn't even understand them, but I failed to several times. But I've had a number of women mentors who were very hands-off and who just kind of created a space for me in which I could do my best work. And I've had that with a couple of women, which is very interesting to me. And I was thinking, the image that I had in my mind was of taking tango lessons in my first year of grad school, and the teacher explaining how to lead. And she said, you don't lead by pulling the follower where you want them to go. You lead by creating a space for them to step into. And I just love that image because I think some people who teach manage to do that. And I haven't figured out how exactly they do. I wish I had, I wish I understood it better. But I've seen some people just create that space for the student or the mentee to step into without shoving them or pulling them or pushing them or ripping their arm, and I kind of wish we had a better also vocabulary or sort of picture or PowerPoint of all the different ways there are to lead, that this teacher-student relationship can happen and can have good energy, or that that maybe there are just multiple versions of this, that B. Isabella has something to add to it.
Can I just add something to the earlier thing you said, and then I will give the mic to Isabella, because it's really interesting how, so we have these, and maybe Agnes, maybe I'm wrong here, but like I do think that it has something to do with like you being a philosopher, Irina, you being, a medieval scholar, literary scholar, my being a philosopher of the arts and a linguist. And so, we're kind of used to specializing and potentially writing things that very few people might end up being interested in. I mean, you can go in on the popular route, but you also have this, you're not building bridges, you're not healing children, you're improving on the collective life of the mind of humanity. And it's a very highly specialized, very, very niche. I mean, even something as Socratic philosophy, which is international, timeless, is a pretty niche field, right? And so there's this attraction to people, emotional attraction, whether that's a student, whether that's a colleague, whether that's a superior, when they are interested in our work, in our field of specialization, or in our angle of our take on it, right? Because like Agnes here, you have a very unique take on contemporary Socratic philosophy, which like puts you into a very small group of philosophers worldwide who have a similar thing. But to me, there is some inherent contradiction here where there's the unhappy man who has reached the top and realized that he is locked in for life. It's very similar to, say, my friends working at the EU or something, EU Commission. You will never leave. Like half of people working at Google are like clinically depressed because you're never going to leave Google. There's no way, right? Your kids are already going to the expensive school. You already like froze your body after your death. There's no way you can leave, right? So you will just do really boring work until you die in the middle of nowhere in California. And the golden cages. And then, but isn't it just something beautifully contradictory to get the recognition of our work as important from somebody who has reached the top in the same hierarchy and shows you that at the top there is only unhappiness? Like, isn't that a beautiful kind of the snake biting into its own tail kind of Ouroboros situation? Anyway, just a thought. Isabella and then Catherine, go.
Yeah, I just wanted to build really quickly on what Irina said. I realized I might have painted a particular picture about that flirtation. I'm very mostly heterosexual, but I have to tell you, there is no other better feeling than a woman who admires my work and getting into that creative flow with another woman. And it feels the same when there is that creative, like, and so I love this metaphor of dancing and leading. And I think there, having had, my research group for 20 years, and thinking, at least certainly some of my graduate students really love the relationships that we have, and I miss them a lot those are the relationships that I miss. What you do as the leader in those contexts in mentorship, I think, is this seeing of the other and seeing their particular way of movement and moving yourself differently as a function of how they move, and they see that you are doing it differently with them than you do with other people. So there is that kind of unique kind of connection with another mind. And with the metaphor, with the dancing, it is actually being able to see and hear someone and giving them the time to like create their own moves and then adjusting to those and sort of celebrating it together, going out in that. And I think that can be, so I actually think there's a really important point here, that I don't think it's just men, women kind of relationships where you can crush hard on somebody else who sees you, who like plucks you out and goes, there's something very unique about something about you, and I want to click with you on that, right? So just to go there.
Yeah, I want to build on both what Isabella and Irina brought up. These are not super formed thoughts, so I'm just going to sort of talk in a circle and we'll see where it goes. But I think part of the challenge of desire and eros is that it feels like a loss of power. And that is one of the scariest things that we can feel, is just losing ourselves to something that feels bigger than us, that's kind of pulling us into something that we can't control. But I think there are so many beautiful ways to feel that can feel mutual and can feel expanding. And so, Irina, what you started talking about with ways that we can feel that within mentorship, within, I just had an experience with some of you here about with intergenerational learning and sort of spiritual development, what that can look like. I'm a musician, and I've always said playing music to me is basically the same as sex. It's just the degree of kind of passionate mutual intimacy that you can enter into with somebody else or a whole group of people, which is even more sexy and fun, is this kind of the desire and eros that can feel mutual can happen in so many realms of life. And I think for sure intellectually, absolutely within academic settings, but within any kind of creative, artistic, soulful way. And so I think one of the things that is the saddest and hardest thing about something that is a hierarchical kind of power abusive version of that is when it gets condensed into it is just about power and just about a certain kind of dominating sex, which is like so one picture of that. And so I do think, I mean, we have example upon example upon example, including stories that both you, Irina, and Agnes have written about that dynamic coming into play. But I think a lot of times one of the great interests of my life and a lot of things that I'm trying to build revolve around how do we help people understand their own desires so that when we feel, I think our desires are often drawing us toward a larger sense of self and a larger purpose and a larger passion that we have. And when we don't take the time to understand that, it can get very misapplied. So it can get skewed into something like, I just want somebody who's more successful to see me. When in reality, what we want is the sense of passionate collaborators who see us, like Isabella was talking about, and performing at the best of our ability, executing at the best of our ability. So I don't know that I have, other than to agree with a lot of what has been said and emphatically, both from my own experience and people that I work with that have been quite harmed from the very abusive and tragic outworkings of some of this kind of power and desire. I think a lot of what I'm interested in trying to help people develop the capability for is how do I understand what my desire is calling me to? What do I actually want? What is it? What is this kind of fusing, melding, communal thing that I long for? And then what does that look like within a dynamic that is mutual, that is safe, that is healthy, and also still provides some sort of intellectual or career, whatever it is, boost. And so, yeah, I don't know that I have deep conclusions. Just to say, I think desire is about this fear of loss of power, and that is where a lot of abuses can come in when we are, when these games are happening, but also when we are not rooted to our own, what it's calling us into. So.
Is it always fearful? Because what Gina, you brought up, and I think it appears in both of the essays, is a desire for a certain loss of power, that it feels good to be taken care of, seen, lifted, that we want to be children. Like we want, and the harder it is, right? The harder it is, or the heavier the load, the more we want to be relieved of it. To me, that's so beautiful, right? It's just that maybe it's being done in an unsafe environment in some cases, or it's hard to tell what is safe, right? That's also can be a fear.
I wanted to add one other thing with the tango. So 2 people brought up tango. I also took tango classes. And I think there's a music connection, Catherine, as well. But
I love that music, tango.
There was one.
There.
There was one thing that I had this instructor who was from Spain, and this was like, I was in Argentina of all places when I took the classes. And there was one thing he said, he was like, the most important rule in tango is to stop. So which I'd never heard before. It was so simple, but it's this idea that it is all improvised, which, if people don't know that, that's amazing. But a lot of how they do it is they stop. And if you pay attention to the number of times they do that, it's to recalibrate and to readjust and to hold space. And so I just think that's so beautiful and very related to power as well. Thought it was a nice add.
I was thinking, as both of you, as Gina and Catherine were speaking, I think the answer to the sort of the bad math of admiration, right? The fact that we can never get enough pats on the head for our book or our, essay in the big journal or whatever it is presence, right? I think that's what I felt, at least, in both of these comments. And, I sucked at tango, but I think it's worth taking tango lessons just to repeat what your teachers say, right? Because the other thing, my teacher said, or some teachers said, was, you have to dance each dance as though it's like the last time you'll ever see that person in your life, right? So you have these 3 minutes or whatever it is, and you are present with that person as though you will never be together again. And I think the moments that, whether in academia or outside of it, that have where I sort of that little mouse or hamster in my head that was looking for little achievement pellets stopped running on the wheel. Those were moments of presence where there was some version of jamming, something like this, right, where we're just not really thinking about status or hierarchy or filling a hole as much as we're filling a space together. But yeah, that's also not how our educational system is organized, right? And it's a little bit of a fight to get it back to that, to try to create these moments of education for our students. I try very hard to do that, but I feel like that momentum is going away, right, in a different direction.
I have a sort of super micro version of this dynamic that I am in very often, and frustrates me, and I've been thinking about. So I thought I would put it before you guys, which is just I'm at a conference or something, and I'm like talking to someone, and like the conversation's going fine in the sense that they'll report, oh, I liked Agnes or whatever. But something in the back of my head is like, this is not the conversation I want to be having. This is not like, and nor is it the other bit there's some other conversation up in platonic heaven that we should be having, but we're having this one instead. So this happens to me all the time, like almost constantly in my life. And it's so frustrating. And I know that I'm contributing just as much as the other person to having the conversation I don't want to have. But it feels like a million little erotic encounters in a certain way, like in that there's something you know, like the thing Catherine was saying, where it's like, there's something that I want, but I don't know what it is. And I don't know how to figure it out, because it's not like we could each lay out all the possible conversations and then have some kind of menu. I've actually thought of doing that. And I have actually done that sometimes in desperation. I'll be like, here's a conversation menu. That works like with my husband, but doesn't work with strangers. But just this thought of like every interaction in a way has this possibility to work. But they actually usually don't. But even when they don't, we kind of like have a lot of language around patting ourselves in the back to say that they are working out. So we're actually reinforcing all the bad ones by saying, oh, it's great to meet you. Thank you. So nice to meet you. Right. So we have this whole thing. But like that, I feel like there's this other thing we're supposed to be doing that we're not doing. And that's like the properly erotic conversation or something like that.
But that's so fun in life and so sad in books. That happens. In books, it's always a missed opportunity, whereas in life, it's all the more complicated. Sorry, anybody else?
Oh, I love the idea of a conversation menu so much. And now I'm just thinking like, nobody has to answer this, but what would your personal version of an erotic conversation menu look like? Like what kinds of conversations would just really get you going? And how hilarious would that be if we were able to just bring that to a party and be like, any of these conversational topics or approaches would turn me on. Please go for it.
I mean,
That's
this
awesome.
is what Agnes, the article in the New Yorker about your husband and you is about. That you were
Is
just
it? Okay.
talking about your favorite topic,
Yep.
and it just really turned you both on very hard. And then you just ended up getting married, right? Like one thing led to another. And that was also a professor-student relationship,
Right.
no? Just the other way around.
Right.
Is it
Right.
different the other way around?
I think maybe it's not like I've had so many, but I've had relationships with professors as well, like when I was an undergrad. I mean, stuff that would be forbidden now. Actually, maybe it was forbidden then too. I don't actually know. I think it's probably different based on the personalities in so many ways that it's a little hard for me to generalize. I guess I think it is clear that I'm someone where my own erotic sensibility is very much tied to the intellectual, right? So I've been on both sides of this. Like it's not surprising. Right. So it's like it's worked out on those occasions, but I feel like it doesn't have to turn into a marriage. It could just be a conversation. It could just last like an hour and we never see each other again. I'm fine with that. In a way, I prefer that. It should be low stakes, meeting new people. There should be some kind of low stakes way in which you actually have the conversation you want to have because you're never seeing each other again anyway. And yet we don't do it. It feels like so many wasted opportunities.
I mean, wasn't there this scandal a couple of years ago that Amy Chua invited her students into her house for dinner? Like, that's not even an erotic relationship. It's like a friendly, playful, intellectual relationship. And somebody who wasn't invited basically turned them in, like it was Stalinism or something. And I mean, I'd never had this in my life, but if we had that at my university, that we could have gone to like the most popular professor's house every week to have dinner and talk about like our favorite topic in the world, that would have been literally the best thing in my life. Like maybe Interintellect wouldn't exist because I would have been satisfied at 24. It's kind of, it's sad, no? And also probably, I mean, just for the teachers as well. I mean, you're talking about how difficult the profession of, multiple professors here is, and it's unfulfilling in some weird ways, and it's bureaucratic, and nobody ever gets what they want out of life, as like it's just not, even if other people think you did. And one of the upsides of it, I would imagine, would be the interaction with the students, that there are all these new younger people coming and they challenge you and it's fun, and that you get to hang out with them and eat together and whatever, and they are adults and you're an adult. And now it's for verboten. Like what's the deal with that? What's going to happen with the,
I do it too. I hope it's not verboten.
No, we're doing
students come to my house. Yeah. I mean, I always invite all the
Chicago
students.
is always different, right?
I would never not invite some of the students of the class. That does seem like a bit of a recipe for disaster, but but yeah, they love it. They love coming. I mean, they're freaked coming to my house. They're freaked. Like they come in and they're just kind of frozen for a minute, but they also love it.
I love it. We're at time, I know, so I just want to be respectful of all the academic careers and late nights. I think this was fun. I think we can share this with the world. Hi, David. Great to see you as well. Calling in note from your cherry orchard. Where is the Jacobian vibe? Anyway.
No. I'm at a corner cafe right now.
Okay, and it's not the season, I just realized, right? Because
Right.
it's September. Yeah, my agricultural knowledge is very rudimentary. Guys, thank you so much. Let's take this to Discord and Twitter. I could do a 3-day seminar, hangout, retreat over just this. We would get a lot of wine and there would be like a group meditation at the end and we would collectively Skype and forgive our mothers at the end, okay? But no,
Let me
we're not ready.
tell you my
We're not
quick and
ready.
That's asking for a lot.
Yeah, I saw the faces. We're not ready. We're not ready. All right. We will continue this conversation somehow at some point, but I do think that there is something very exciting to discuss. And one thing that we kind of dipped our toes into, but it's such a difficult topic right now, is really the power of like female youth and beauty in these situations and whether that's actually empowering to women, right? I mean, we're talking about the fact that we might have far less power on this earth than men in many ways, but then we have this one thing. Are we allowed to use it? And if so, what are the ethics, right? And if we can't discuss it, how are we to arrive at what the ethics are? Because we can't, if we can't talk about it. So maybe like a good follow-up event to this one would be to talk about that. Maybe.
I also wonder how much that's changing as the demographics and industries change.
Yeah, and also like,
I mean, it's very different if there are only 2 female grad students in a class.
yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. So we can talk about that as well. Maybe we will like have like with the Pessoa one, we will choose like a very innocent looking literary piece. And then we are just only talking about that, nothing else. Okay. Or we will talk about Mad Men or something, like we will pretend it's about 1960s, like the TV series Mad Men does. And so we can like raise those issues. Guys, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure. And Molly, I loved your quips. You won the Zoom chat game today.
Hey.
Thank you so much. I will see
I'll chat so you don't have to
Take
hear
care.
the dog. Bye. Thank
Bye,
you.
ciao, ciao. Thank you so much.
Bye.